If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you've probably seen the episode in which I made the rather bold claim that the goal of all filmmakers should be to immerse the audience in the story. In that episode, I looked at how Christopher Nolan uses story structure and editing to give the audience the same experiences as characters and thus immerse them in the story. I enjoyed the research for that episode so much that I decided to try and do this with every significant or popular filmmaker. I was going to start with Steven Spielberg, but then I realised, well, everybody does Steven Spielberg, so I decided to put my analytical skills to the test and challenge myself with a filmmaker who was a bit more limited. Now, when I set myself this challenge, I knew it was going to be difficult, but I didn't realise just how difficult it was going to be. No matter which film I watched, which scene I analysed, what perspective I took, I was no closer to getting the answer to my question. And after 7 Michael Bay movies, 4 of them in a row, I just gave up. It was only when a couple of days later, when I was in the cinema and I was watching a trailer for a drama, and some guy a couple of rows behind me shouted at the screen and said, "Get this fucking shit off! I don't give a fuck about any faggy drama. I just want to see shit blow up." Suddenly, I knew exactly what I was looking for. The problem wasn't Michael Bay's filmmaking. The problem was my assumptions about Michael Bay's filmmaking. I incorrectly assumed that, like every other director, his goal would be to immerse audiences in his story, when Mike is actually far more interested in impressing people with his visuals. And I think the reason for this is that Mike isn't trying to immerse audiences in his story. He's trying to immerse his audience in his movie. I know that sounds odd, but stick with me. So how does he do this? So before we can talk about those things, we need to talk about who Michael Bay's audience is, because it's going to be integral to figuring out why he uses the techniques that he does. So one thing I think Michael Bay did very well is he identified his target audience very early with his first film, Bad Boys. His target audience is an audience that's typically not catered for by the cinematic community, and that's people with shorter attention spans, lower levels of patience, and the need for constant stimulation. These are the type of people that you'll see scrolling through the newsfeed on their phone on Facebook instead of watching the movie. These people need the constant stimulation in order to stay engaged with the film, and I think Michael Bay recognised that and has been giving it to them ever since. So the first technique that he uses is shot composition. Now, just in case you're not a film nerd like me and you're not really aware of what shot composition is, basically shot composition is everything that you see in any given shot. So it's a matter of what is included in that frame for your eyes to see. Through watching so many Michael Bay movies recently, one thing really struck me. Whether I like the way he films or not, there is no denying his ability to compose shots is pretty fucking good. Seriously. He manages to create epic shots with his spectacular compositional technique and seems to have a firm grasp of how shot composition can be used really well, especially when we then add in the fact that he tailors them to suit people with shorter attention spans. Now, he knows that his audience gets bored and disengaged when the scene is too static, so one of the first techniques that he does in his shot composition is he utilises layers. He will constantly have something moving in the background and foreground in order to attract attention. This is something that Akira Kurosawa was very famous for doing as well. I think why he does this is so that people who have shorter attention spans and whose gaze is likely to jump around a bit more, they're always going to land on something that catches their attention on the screen, which is very good for those kinds of people. Another thing that he does is he uses a telephoto lens to shoot pretty much everything. And this has the effect of flattening these 3 layers together and making them seem more shallow. And this emphasizes movement within the frame. One thing that he does really well with this technique is he uses this flatter frame to then utilize the vertices of the frame to create something eye-catching. Now, if we overlay a grid onto a Michael Bay shot like this, this shot from the beginning of Bad Boys. I'm not going to talk about all the 9 sections of the screen because that's really not the focus of this video or Michael Bay, but one thing he is very aware of is how to use these lines, the horizontal and the vertical vertices. And he will often have motion across these 2 vertices at the same time to create more dynamic shots. As we can see in this shot of Bad Boys, we have movement along the horizontal vertices with the ferry behind him, and then we have movement along the vertical vertices as the car starts to travel towards us. Again, this is done to keep people with shorter attention spans visually stimulated and thus more engaged in his movie, totally immersing them in the film. Now for people like me, this type of filmmaking is a fucking nightmare, but for Michael Bay's audience, this is excellent. Another effect of using the telephoto lens to flatten these layers together is that in each shot, everything is essentially significant or moving or eye-catching. Now what this does is, it says that no one thing in this shot is more important than the others, and in fact the shot itself is greater than the sum of its parts. The reason for doing this is that by doing so, Michael Bay is telling us that there is nothing in particular that we need to concentrate on in this shot, and that we can just take in all the visuals as a whole and not have to think too hard about what we're supposed to be paying attention to. This is especially good for people with shorter attention spans, just because the most cited reason for becoming disengaged in a film by that type of person is that they have to concentrate for too long and it gets tiring for them and they get bored and become disengaged. But Michael Bay is giving us a visual cue in each and every shot to tell us that actually we don't need to focus too hard on this movie and that you can relax your brain. Now, I bet you didn't think the Michael Bay shots were so meticulously planned, right? Me neither, until now. And this gets even more insane when you take into account that Michael Bay does not storyboard any of his movies, which is fucking insane when you imagine the amount of chaos that happens in his films and none of it is storyboarded. Just for comparison, this is like a builder creating a house without a blueprint or an architect plan. He just plans all this visual madness in his head and then executes it, which must be frustrating for his crew, but it's incredibly impressive that he can do that. The second thing that Michael Bay does is he moves the camera a lot. The interesting thing about Michael Bay's camera work is how chaotic and unplanned it seems, yet plenty of people try to copy it and fail miserably. Just as an example, I'm going to show you this shot from Battleship and Pain and Gain. Obviously, Michael Bay didn't direct Battleship, he did direct Pain and Gain. Now if you look at the shot from Battleship, it doesn't look anywhere near as dynamic and interesting as the same shot from Pain and Gain. Both shots look the same. It's clearly an attempt to copy him, but it isn't executed anywhere nearly as well. Now, Michael Bay doesn't use this just to flatten the layers. The reason that he wants the layers flattened is so that when he does this 360 shot, it creates this very pronounced parallax effect between the fore, mid and background, which doesn't happen in the shot from Battleship. He also utilizes the vertices of the frame and has the actor stand up in the center, so we have horizontal movement from the camera spinning around the actor, and then we have vertical movement from the actor himself, and this is all flattened with the telephoto lens, creating that very significant parallax effect. This is something only Michael Bay does. No other filmmaker does this, as far as I'm aware. So another thing that I want to talk about with Michael Bay's camera movement is, like I said before, he doesn't seem to be too interested in the writing of the film. He doesn't seem to care about the plot, the dialogue, or the characters. What he does try to do is tell the story with his camera work. In essence, he is the ultimate show don't tell director. In fact, you could call him a show don't tell extremist, because he does take it a bit too far. But this is part of the reason why he's such a successful international director as well. More on that in a minute. He knows that his audience has a little attention or patience to follow plot, and as such, he relies on visuals on a scene-to-scene basis to keep his audience's attention and floods each shot with visual stimulus. The reason for this is, rather than relying on the writer to tell the story, he tries to let the camera do this instead, knowing full well this is how his audience is able to follow the plot. The famous Bay 360, which we just looked at, is always utilized to signify a protagonist. It is never used for an antagonist or villain. And conversely, a series of very quickly edited extreme close-ups signal who the antagonist is. Now obviously the reasons for these are pretty simple and obvious once they're explained. The quick edited close-ups of the villain is to show you that the villain himself is a fractured personality. We get these series of quick extreme close-ups because we can only see the sum of the parts. In fact, one would say that he has an extremely broken personality. And the same goes with the hero shot, the 360 around the character. This is so that we can take in everything about this character. He is complete, he is whole, he's heroic. Visual cues like this are littered throughout his films. They're intended for his audience to help simplify the plot into a series of visual images, meaning that the audience doesn't need to try and understand it mentally, they can take it all in visually. Even in instances where he has to have a static shot, he still understands the attention span of his audiences, and he uses his third technique to help hold their attention, and that is editing. He will edit the scene very quickly, and he will cut every 24 to 45 frames to try and keep them interested and engaged. To me, it's cinema suicide because I can't stand it, but it's exactly what his audience needs and wants. This technique of foregoing story and character development in favour of trying to show action through camera and composition is, in my opinion, directly responsible for why Mike is so successful with international audiences. International audiences often have a language and cultural barrier, so like the shorter attention span people, if the visuals aren't fast paced, they get bored and lose interest. Since Michael Bay doesn't rely on characters explaining complicated plot points or comedic beats through character dialogue, it means that none of the aspects of his movies are lost in translation and transfer perfectly to any culture without even needing any translation at all. Can you name any other director who instantly bridges any language or culture? I can't. So that's it. That's how to immerse an audience like Michael Bay. If you're a person who's looking to become a big international director like Michael Bay, this episode is super useful for you because these techniques are going to help you do the same thing that Michael Bay did. I'd just like to say thanks for watching this episode. Like with the Nolan episode, it's been fun to research. Alright, that was a lie. Watching 7 Michael Bay movies was not fun at all. But I did learn an awful lot of shit that I didn't know about Michael Bay, and discovered that he's not nearly as chaotic and terrible as he seems. He just has very different goals. If you enjoyed this episode and learned something about Michael Bay that you didn't already know, then give me a thumbs up and a hell yeah in the comments section. And if you didn't learn anything, then give me a thumbs down and tell me what you'd like to see more of in future videos. Thanks again guys, I'll catch you on the next episode.